I am delighted to kick off the first Budget Committee hearing of this year by welcoming Ranking Member Grassley, who I serve with also on the Finance and Judiciary Committees, so we have a lot of experience working together, and I'm very happy that he's the ranking member. I want to welcome all the colleagues who will be in and out of the hearing this morning. We have multiple hearings going on, and so you will be getting attendance sporadically from a considerable number of our members. I want to particularly welcome our new members to what I hope will be a busy, revived, impactful, and lively Budget Committee. I want this to be your surprise favorite committee. We have important work to do on bipartisan health care reforms, on reforming this committee's process to fit the basic arithmetic of the budget, and on issues important to each of you as members. We're going to begin with a series of hearings on the looming costs and economic risks of climate upheaval. Almost exactly 5 years ago, I sent around this binder to all of my Senate colleagues in which I compiled some of the most compelling warnings about the economic risks associated with climate change. Last week, I sent your staffs an updated version of the binder. Here it is. As you can see, the warnings keep piling up. Have fun with the light reading. These warnings come from central bankers, economists, asset managers, insurance companies, investment banks, credit rating agencies, and leading management consultants, folks with a lot of credibility when it comes to economics, finance, corporate risk, and their effect on government spending and revenues. These will be our witnesses, economists, scientists, business leaders, and other financial and risk experts, many of whose work is in this binder. I've said that science provides the headlights for society, that it's scientists who illuminate the way for us to navigate into the future. Think of the economists and scientists we'll hear from as the headlights for the United States Congress as this committee helps navigate our long-term budget and fiscal priorities. Look at our national debt. One thing that stands out is how much of it was incurred as a result of exogenous shocks to the economy. Consider the 2008 financial crisis, which blew up the financial security of families and businesses across the country and reduced government revenues for a decade. 2 years after the recession, CBO found that projected revenues fell by $4.4 trillion and projected spending rose by $800 billion to spur that recovery. Consider the pandemic. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that the federal response to the pandemic, which brought COVID under control, protected families, and jump-started our economic recovery, will add $5.5 trillion to our deficits. That doesn't factor in lost revenue or lost economic activity, so the total economic cost is actually higher. We came through both, but together those two exogenous shocks contributed $10 trillion to the federal debt, more than 40% of the total, proof of how catastrophic events can and do affect the federal budget and the economy, and how life has a way of upsetting best-laid plans and 10-year budget baselines. Headlights and better attention to what they illuminated could have helped. Plenty of financial experts saw the 2008 mortgage mess coming. Plenty of epidemiologists warned that the country was woefully unprepared for a pandemic. Now, we have all these warnings. Warnings of crashes in coastal property values as rising seas and more powerful storms hit the 30-year mortgage horizon. Warnings of insurance collapse from more frequent, intense, and unpredictable wildfires. A dangerous interplay between the insurance and mortgage markets hitting real estate markets across the country. Inflation from decreased agricultural yields, massive infrastructure demand, trouble in municipal bond markets, stranded assets, and a carbon bubble. The most dangerous risks are called systemic, meaning that they will cascade out into the broader economy as the mortgage problem did in 2008. and it's big. Deloitte predicts the differential between being responsible and reckless about climate could sum to more than $220 trillion globally between now and 2070. Some of these warned of risks are already upon us. Already, climate-related natural disasters increase federal spending on disaster assistance, flood insurance, crop insurance, and other programs we fund. But this is just the beginning. It will certainly get worse, much worse, particularly if warming exceeds 1.5 degrees. We are on a bad trajectory. It's time for us all to wake up and face the problem before coastal cities flood with water or Southwest cities can't get water. I hope we can fend that off with action if we snap into focus on the danger. We are all familiar with the tragedy of the Commons. In 2015, our opening witness, Dr. Carney, gave a speech entitled "The Tragedy of the Horizon," because some of the gravest dangers of climate change, which we could head off today, come to pass years or decades out. Rhode Island's coastline will be gone, reshaped into an archipelago by 2100, you say. Who cares? What's that? It's an eternity. Well, almost exactly a year ago, I became a grandfather for the first time. Baby Vera, God willing, will be alive in 2100. When I look at her, I'm looking at that future. Walk by any elementary school. The faces you see on the playground, God willing, will be alive in 2100. How will those little ones remember our less than greatest generation? We owe it to kids on playgrounds all across America to pay attention to get this right. By the end of this series of hearings, if we hear these expert witnesses, if we treat their testimony as our headlights, then our path, I hope, will be clear. Thank you, and let's get to work. I turn to my ranking member, Senator Grassley.
Senator Whitehouse, I compliment you on your leadership of this committee and look forward to the 2 years ahead. I'm pleased to be here with all of you as ranking member. Despite our political differences, and they aren't as great as the public believes between Republicans and Democrats, and particularly between Grassley and Whitehouse, I know that we can find common areas of agreement to work on together. One area of agreement must be that our budget and appropriation process is broken. This sentiment isn't new at all, nor is it particularly partisan. No person could look at last year's process and say that things are working. For fiscal year 2023, Congress didn't adopt a budget. The Senate Appropriations Committee didn't mark up a single bill, and not one of the 12 individual appropriation bills was debated on the Senate floor. Instead, we were presented with a $1.7 trillion omnibus just a few days before Congress. Things need to change. Now, maybe we shouldn't be surprised, because when the Senate goes into session at 3 o'clock on Monday and has one vote, hardly any business, and then you work all day Tuesday and all day Wednesday and adjourn at 1:45 on Thursday, you can't get a lot of session work done when you just are in session 2.5 weeks, compared to when I came to the United States Senate, started no later than noon on Monday, debated on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, went home Friday at 4. So I think there needs to be some reanalysis of the work that we're putting, I mean, not the work, because there's plenty of work for senators, but the amount of time that we're in session. I want to applaud two leaders in this process, Senator Murray and Collins, for publicly announcing their commitment to regular order, including debating appropriation bills on the Senate floor. We need to do our part to make that happen. We should also agree that our nation's fiscal outlook is dire. The Congressional Budget Office will release an updated budget projection this afternoon. Every indication is that their new projections will be as bad as or worse than last summer's projection. This is what they told us last summer. Within 10 years, public debt as a share of our economy will exceed World War II record highs. However, unlike after World War II, when spending and debt subsided, our public debt is projected to climb even higher. Our public debt will reach 110% of our economy in 2032 and grow to 185% 2052. Trillion-dollar annual deficits will be replaced by $2 trillion deficits within a few years. Simply serving the debt will lead to record-breaking annual costs of more than $1 trillion within 10 years. So, Mr. Chairman, your immediate predecessor refused to bring in CBO to discuss the overall budget outlook. This was a mistake. So I urge, under your leadership, to hold a hearing with CBO on the latest outlook. Nobody benefits from just burying our heads in the sand. I acknowledge that a changing climate is a historic and scientific fact. I also recognize that most scientists agree man-made emissions contribute to climate change. Throughout my career, I've advocated for renewable and alternative energy solutions. Being the father of the wind energy tax credit in 1992, I think maybe I was doing that 10 years before climate change was much of an issue. And so today in Iowa, we get 60% of our electricity from wind, and in 4 years, American Energy, Des Moines, Iowa, will be getting 80%, 85%, maybe more accurately, of their energy from wind. This being said, even if the entire U.S. stopped emitting greenhouse gas tomorrow, projected temperatures would only be 0.3 degrees Fahrenheit lower come 2100. Even in this unrealistic scenario, the U.S. would still need major polluters like China and India to pull their weight. As we look to address climate and energy issues, the nation must also address our fiscal health. There's plenty of blame to go around for how we got into our current situation. Republican or Democrats have to share this blame. For decades, Congress turned a blind eye as our nation walked toward a fiscal cliff. But Democrats turned that walk into a sprint. In March 2021, Democrats took advantage of an emergency situation to pass a $2 trillion partisan spending bill, even as our economy showed strong signs of recovery. Then as inflation soared to 40-year high, they doubled down, spending trillions more on their liberal wish list. They pushed through omnibus appropriation bills with take it or leave it mantras for 2 years, each time growing the size of the government when not using fast-track procedures or government shutdown as leverage. The administration drove deficits through unilateral action like student loan giveaways that could cost taxpayers $1 trillion. Congress needs then, it's very obvious, a fiscal reality check. And I know our chairman's trying to bring that fiscal reality check by bringing up all of the issues that climate change is going to add to the budget, and that's the correct thing to do. But this reality check has to start with this committee getting back to performing core functions. This includes holding hearings on federal fiscal matters, examining programs and authorizations that have been on autopilot for decades, and performing robust oversight of agency spending. No government entity should be exempt. Now, finally, I welcome the opportunity to work with you, Senator Whitehouse, on budget process reform. You are a well-established leader on this issue. I appreciate your stated interest in working with the rest of us on this issue starting, and I'll be ready to join you anytime, from where we left off with Senator Enzi in 2019. It was a bipartisan process then, and I think we can build to get it over the finish line this Congress. Needless to say, we have our work cut out for us to get our fiscal house in order. To paraphrase former Fed Chairman Paul Volcker, cutting spending may be painful, but the pain for all of us will be much greater if it isn't accomplished. So I look forward to our work over the next 2 years.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. So do I. And I mentioned the budget process reform in my opening remarks for a reason. I look forward to working on that. And I think there's plenty of blame to go around for where we are in terms of the deficit, but having a budget committee that actually looks at the elements of that in an arithmetically correct way is a very, very good start. I am pleased to have three very distinguished witnesses here to testify before us today. Joining us remotely is Dr. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. For those not familiar with that role, that's effectively the CEO. Dr. Carney is a world-renowned central banker and has long been sounding the alarm about the economic risks posed by climate change. Following Dr. Carney's testimony, we'll hear from Dr. Bob Litterman, who chaired the Commodity Futures Trading Commission's Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee, which in 2020 issued an authoritative report on this subject. Following Dr. Litterman, we will hear from Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, former director of the Congressional Budget Office and president of the American Action Forum. I note that back in 2003, CBO prepared a report on the economics of climate change under Dr. Holtz-Eakin's leadership. Dr. Carney, if we have you here remotely, please take 5 minutes to deliver your remarks. Your prepared remarks are in the record of the proceeding.
Understood. Thank you very much, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, for the honor of this invitation to address the risks and economic costs of climate change. During my terms as Governor of the Bank of England and as Chair of the Financial Stability Board, I headed committees with responsibility for understanding and addressing the principal risks to financial stability, risks such as the Chair referred to in his opening comments. About a decade ago, these bodies became increasingly concerned about the rising economic risk from climate change and the fact that the financial system lacked the information, the tools, and the markets to manage them. So over the following years, a wide range of regulatory authorities and private financial institutions have worked to develop the building blocks of a financial system that can manage these risks on behalf of their depositors, pensioners, clients, and shareholders. But while the pace of change has picked up, it's not yet equal to the scale of the challenge. Due to the undiversifiable nature of climate risk, governments will bear many of the costs of extreme weather and of adaptation. And moreover, the longer adjustments delayed, the greater the impact will be on financial stability, inflation, jobs, and growth. Conversely, transitioning to a low-carbon economy will reduce the impact of climate change, create jobs of the future, and promote a resilient financial system. I won't read into the record the fact that the physical impacts of climate change are rising. I've referenced in my testimony some of the data collected by the EPA, the NOAA, NASA, amongst others, that provides a snapshot of how it's already impacting the United States. Climate change is having an increased impact on Americans. Adjusted for inflation, the number of billion-dollar disasters has risen sixfold from the first half of the 1980s to an average of 18 per year over the past 5 years. Annual inflation-adjusted costs of these disasters have risen 7 times, from 18 billion to 120 billion. Increased flooding and coastal erosion are causing significant damage already. Increases in weather-related disasters have led to insurance becoming less available and more expensive for American families and businesses. Extreme weather is reducing incomes for farmers and raising food costs for families. And the increased frequency and intensity of flooding and disasters disrupts and damages critical infrastructure and in turn supply chains, hurting American businesses and raising costs, again, for American families. There is ample scientific evidence that these trends are expected to worsen, as each additional fraction of a degree warming means more frequent and intense hurricanes, coastal flooding, heat waves, and wildfires. Estimates suggest that over the balance of this century, climate change could reduce the level of global GDP per capita by between 10 to 20% without further efforts to limit warming. Similar estimates have been found for the United States. As economically significant as these estimates are, it's instructive to examine what's not included in them, both assets outside of the market economy, such as biodiversity and human health, as well as critical economic channels, including disrupted supply chains, risks to monetary and financial stability, and the economic impacts of rising risks to national security. As temperatures increase and extreme weather events worsen, the cost to governments will increase further. Ultimately, Governments, state, local, and federal, will bear costs that private households and businesses and markets are unable to shoulder, including meeting emergency needs, financing disaster recovery, and building resilience to future extreme weather. To conclude, the costs to property, agriculture, and livelihoods are already high and expected to grow materially. The hit to GDP growth from unmitigated climate change is expected to be significant, and many of the most severe impacts to human health, to livelihoods, to natural heritage are not included in these calculations. But there's one final risk from climate change, a negative risk, better known as an opportunity. Increased recognition of the risks of climate change is now galvanizing efforts to address the issue. Last year, over $1 trillion was invested in the energy transition, representing over 1% of global GDP, and those investments are expected to rise significantly, creating more jobs and higher incomes. In short, while ignoring climate change will lead to significant costs, climate solutions are becoming one of the greatest commercial opportunities of our time. Thank you for your attention. I'll be pleased to answer questions.
Thanks, Dr. Carney. We turn now to Dr. Litterman.
Thank you. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to address the economic risks associated with climate change and the tremendous costs they may impose on Americans. This summer, I visited Greenland to study the melting of the ice sheet. The icebergs calving from the glaciers are beautiful, but they represent the very beginning of what sadly will be an inevitable acceleration of sea level rise, the timing of which, however, is both highly uncertain and depends critically on the actions that we take today. I want to focus your attention on time, because time is a scarce resource in managing risk. Climate change is a long-term global risk management failure, but it must be addressed immediately because we don't know how much time we have. The United States has an urgent responsibility to do much more than it has to date. Our grandchildren face grave danger. Global sea level rise in this century, for example, is estimated to be between 2 and up to 10 feet, depending primarily on how quickly we reduce our emissions. Before I go any further, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background, as much of my work is highly relevant to today's subject. I am an economist by training and have spent my career managing financial risk. I worked at Goldman Sachs for 23 years. I was a partner and head of the firm-wide risk department. I now sit on several boards for groups that study and propose responses to climate risk, including the Climate Leadership Council and the Niskanen Center. No doubt the reason I am here today is because in 2020 I chaired the CFTC Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee, which published a unanimous and widely cited report, Managing Climate Risk in the U.S. Financial System. We had environmental organizations such as the Nature Conservancy and the Environmental Defense Fund, but also agribusiness companies like Cargill and Bunge, oil and gas companies like ConocoPhillips and BP, and banks like Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase, and Citi. There was no collection of wild-eyed environmental activists, nor were politics involved. This was a rigorous report with dozens of recommendations from hard-headed experts, and we came to the unanimous conclusion that climate change poses significant risks to the American economy that must be addressed urgently. In the agricultural sector, for example, we found that climate change is likely to significantly reduce crop yields, decrease labor productivity, degrade soil and water quality, increase the range and virulence of pests, and disrupt supply chains. Climate change will also impose large costs on companies and governments. One example the CFTC report highlighted was the case of Pacific Gas and Electric in California, which entered bankruptcy because of $30 billion in liabilities associated with its infrastructure sparking record wildfires. Extreme weather impacts are already here and are growing rapidly, including heat waves, floods, hurricanes, drought, and wildfires. Meanwhile, the effects of climate change loom ever larger in the future. Losses from billion-dollar extreme weather events totaled $165 billion last year, and while it varies from year to year, the costs from climate change are clearly growing rapidly. Extreme weather events are becoming more common as the atmosphere warms. Terms such as the 100-year flood are used to describe the magnitude of an event that has happened historically on average once every 100 years. That happens to be an important frequency. We build infrastructure to withstand events that happen on a regular basis, and so the damage created by weather that happens regularly is small. But when a 100-year event occurs, the magnitude is so large that we're not prepared, and it typically leads to complete destruction of property. The problem is that while such a term continues to describe the magnitude of extreme weather events, their frequency of occurrence today tends to be much higher. Declining real estate values driven by climate-related impacts or the expectation of such impacts in the future could substantially depress regional economic activity in exposed areas. Climate change will also likely inflict large costs on human health, and its impacts will fall hardest on those with fewer resources, increasing inequity. There are also a number of risks related to crossing a tipping point. A tipping point is a nonlinearity in the response of a system, and there are a number of worrying potential tipping points in the climatic system. More worrying still, recent scientific research suggests that we may cross several of these tipping points with even only a 1.5 degree of warming, and may cross several additional ones with 2 degrees of warming. While the subject of this hearing is the economic risks and costs associated with climate change, I would be remiss if I did not mention one last thing. All of the research and analysis on this subject agrees that the sooner we act to reduce emissions, the lower will be the expected costs and risks we incur. In addition, a rapid transition to a low-carbon economy will, by removing policy uncertainty, likely actually result in substantial investment and increased economic growth. I have lots of ideas on this subject, but the bottom line is that with global average temperatures already having risen over 1 degree C, and with potentially catastrophic tipping points on the horizon, risk management demands an immediate response leading to globally harmonized incentives to reduce emissions. There are immediate steps that this Congress can take to move this process forward, and I would welcome the opportunity to discuss the policies you might pursue to help de-risk the economy and ensure that prices reflect the actual costs associated with production of goods, including the damages created by carbon emissions. Thank you.
We look forward to taking you up on that offer, Dr. Litterman, and turn to Dr. Holtz-Eakin.
Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, members of the committee, thank you for the privilege of being here today. Let me make 3 points quickly, and then I look forward to the chance to answer your questions. The first point is that climate change will have real impacts on the U.S. economy, and these will worsen the federal budget outlook. Unquestionably, there will be additional outlays from national flood insurance programs and other disaster, crop risk kinds of programs and mandatory outlays. The Congress will probably choose to make some discretionary outlays in the future in response to needs for mitigation and or adaptation, and these will worsen the budget picture. But the biggest impact is going to be lower revenues from an economy that grows more slowly over the long term, and that the loss of some capital assets, diminished labor productivity, diminished productivity in agricultural lands will cumulatively reduce inflows to the federal budget. The Congressional Budget Office recently took a look at this issue and concluded that the center point of a set of estimates for the impact would be about a percentage point lower in GDP by 2051. And that I'll just point out that while that's a significant impact, it's tantamount to under a 1/10 of a percentage point slower growth each and every year. In contrast, and this is point number 2, the federal budget presents an immediate and much larger economic threat. We already have debt to GDP in the range of 100%, and there's a large literature that stems from the work of Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhart that indicates that countries in that range experience slower growth on the order of a percentage point per year because of their debt burdens. And the U.S. not only has entered that range, it has a budget outlook which is unsustainable. The CBO will put out a revised economic and budget outlook this afternoon at 2 o'clock. It will doubtlessly look like the one they put out last year that shows spending exceeding revenues as far as the eye can see, driven by very rapid growth in the outlays for Medicare at 7% a year, Social Security at 6% a year, faster than any revenue source could possibly grow. And as a result, it will show debt relative to GDP rising as far as the eye can see, the interest costs of carrying that debt rising as far as can see. And that is a mechanism which is a guarantee for slower growth in the future. The point of the borrowing is not just the debt. The point is that that brings resources from the private sector into the government sector. And for every dollar you take from private investment and put into the best of federal infrastructure investments, you lose about 50% of the rate of the return. So you're losing on every one of those borrowing activities, diminishing the productivity in the economy, lowering the standard of living for future workers and next generations. we really don't spend a lot of money on investments in the federal government. More likely, we're going to take that money from a private investment and put it into a consumption expenditure. That's the point of Social Security and Medicare, is to raise the standard of living in retirement for seniors. There's no rate of return to consumption investment. So the federal budget is the biggest headwind to economic growth because it is stacked against investing in the future and needs to be brought into some sort of sustainable alignment in order to stop these headwinds to growth. The other point that's going on in the federal budget is that the mandatory spendings are crowding out discretionary spending. Discretionary spending is where we do national security, basic research, infrastructure, education, all of the places where you can invest in the future of the country, and those opportunities are getting squeezed out by the growth of these mandatory programs. So point number 3, not only would getting the budget on a sustainable trajectory improve the economic outlook, it would free up the budget resources to investments, especially investments in the climate mitigation and adaptation that are so important to this committee and to this hearing. And so I can't think of a single bigger accomplishment than for this committee and the U.S. Congress to finally come to grips with the federal budget outlook and its unsustainability. It lies at the crossroads of all the threats to our future and needs to be addressed as quickly as possible. And thank you for the chance to be here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin. I'll lead, and then Senator Romney is next in line. Dr. Carney, you've held 2 of the most significant and powerful positions globally in the banking sector. Climate change was not customarily a part of the banking sector's interest. Why is it that you took such an interest in addressing climate change?
Thank you, Chair. It goes back in part to your opening comments, some of the points you made in your opening comments, which is that underinvesting in resilience up front leads to much greater cost down the road. And it was particularly when I became governor of the Bank of England, and it's not commonly known, but one of the responsibilities of the Bank of England is to oversee the insurance industry. And it's the 4th largest insurance industry in the world. It includes one of the largest, if not the largest, reinsurance market, famous Lloyd's of London. And therefore, that's a property and casualty and reinsurance industry that's directly affected by climate change. And one of the lessons that the brokers and the risk managers in Lloyd's of London had determined was that the tail risks of the past were becoming the central scenario of the future. I'll refer to Dr. Litterman's comments about 1 in 100 risk events becoming that much more frequent. So of course they're adjusting pricing, they're adjusting coverage, which has real implications for economies. And it's apparent to us as risk managers that this will affect the economy more broadly and the financial system potentially more broadly if there is not adequate information to assess the potential degree of those risks. And if risk managers don't at least have the opportunity to determine whether or not they will take steps to...
Dr. Carney, you were in charge of the Bank of Canada after the 2008 financial crisis. Can you compare what you foresee with respect to climate with what you experienced in the 2008 mortgage crisis?
Well, there's 2 things that I would say. The first is that one of the experiences of that crisis, and many of the members, of course, lived through it and helped manage through it, is what's called a Minsky moment, a realization that basic assumptions were no longer true, that, for example, that house prices would never fall in the United States, that capital was money good, that assets off balance sheets would stay off balance sheets. All of those proved false. And led to the collapse or virtual collapse of the core, much of the core of the financial system, with huge economic costs that ultimately have added to the debt burden of the United States, amongst other countries. Now, in Canada, we were more fortunate for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons was we had put more resilience into our financial institutions up front.
Without getting into Canada specifically and looking at comparison between what you project potentially happening with the climate crisis, what's the scale comparison in your mind between what we experienced with the 2008 financial crisis and what climate portends for our systems?
Okay, so I'll just lead from that point. The first point is What we want to avoid is a rapid and sudden adjustment to the climate crisis, both adaptation, the impact of physical damage, or belated investments to address the issue. The orders of magnitude are potentially similar in those cases if we delay adjustment. If we adjust up front, actually, I'm of the view that we can actually grow economies through the investments, which would improve competitiveness. But if we delay it until it's evident, and this is the tragedy of the horizon, supremely evident to everybody, then the orders of magnitude approach the financial crisis.
And just to be clear, your testimony is that climate change could reduce the level of global GDP per capita by 10 to 20%. And in that calculation, you leave out critical economic channels that have not been modeled, including disrupted supply chains, challenges to monetary and financial stability that increasing climate change will present, and potential economic impact of rising risks to national security. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary, and one of the lessons of large shocks is they get amplified as they come through the financial sector, yes.
Dr. Litterman, the papers we have in front of us are littered with the phrase systemic risk. It seems like a mild little term. Could you give us a sense of what its impact is?
The systemic risk that's incorporated in climate change comes from the uncertainty about how the economy is going to be responding to the various different hazards that are increasing. So we have whole areas of the country that may be impacted by extreme weather. Florida, for instance, that could lead to significant financial stress in terms of the ability to raise funds for capital. So you can have significant systemic impacts on the economy. It's one of those things that we just don't know.
The economy.
Excuse me?
Systemic meaning it cascades through the economy into sectors that
exactly.
weren't immediately affected.
It'll affect every aspect of the economy, including government budgets.
And last question, you said you were hard-headed about your report. Explain.
Yeah, this is a report that was created by a bunch of scientists, academics, business people, investors, and we came to unanimous agreement. It wasn't about I don't know, gut feeling. It was about facts. And the problem is we don't know what the future is going to bring. So we have to be prepared. It's very simple.
Good word to end on.
Yeah.
I think my clock started a little bit late, so if the ranking member would like to go a little bit beyond, that would be all's fair. And I turn to Senator Grassley, Senator Padilla next, Senator Romney next, unless Senator Marshall returns.
Dr. Holzhausen, our rising debt and deficits are cast by a lot of people as long-term challenge, quote unquote, long-term challenge. Something we will have to deal with in the future, but not immediate problem today. Is that really the case, or are we already living with the consequences of reckless spending and borrowing?
Well, I certainly believe the impacts are immediate and shouldn't be put off. Most people characterize the threat as something that looks like, you know, a Greece, Portugal sovereign debt meltdown that would happen somewhere in the future if we just did nothing. But the reality is that the mechanism I described in my opening remarks, the diminished productivity, the headwinds to the raising the standard of living are going on in small amounts every single year. They might be too tiny to notice in the moment, but cumulatively, they are an enormous impact on our progress. And so I think it's something that needs to be rectified immediately, both in and of itself, but also because it would allow the Congress more flexibility in pursuing other policy objectives.
Also to you, in last week's State of the Union address, the president once again tried to portray himself as a deficit reducer. He pointed to last year's $1.4 trillion deficit, which was lower than the 2020 deficits due to cessation of bipartisan pandemic relief. So to you, how would you rate the president's budgetary performance so far?
I think the administration has done nothing to improve the budgetary outlook. Certainly, if you look back at 2021, the American Rescue Plan was an enormous policy error, something I said at the time, so it's not 2020 hindsight. This is a $2 trillion stimulus in an economy that was growing at 6.5%. It's too big, was unnecessary, was poorly designed, led to a lot of inflation. And this has been followed by several proposals called Build Back Better that did not add up in any meaningful way and would have added to the core structural deficit in the United States. He's taken administrative actions for hundreds of billions of dollars of student loan relief that are difficult for me to defend. So I don't see any activities being taken by the administration that are recognizing the problems that the federal budget faces. And we need some leadership on that front.
Dr. Carney, in last week's State of the Union address, President Biden admitted that the U.S. will need oil and gas, quote unquote, for a while. Your firm, Brookfield Asset Management, has invested in oil and gas infrastructure around the world. Do you believe that the U.S. government should mandate private institutions divest from their fossil fuel interests? And if so, what immediate impact would this have on the average American?
The first thing, I agree with the president in the timeline and the continued need for fossil fuels. Secondly, I'll just note on Brookfield is one of the largest investors in renewable and operators of renewables in the world. Thirdly, no, I don't believe, and I've never advocated mandatory divestment of fossil fuel assets. In fact, to address the climate challenge, what is necessary is to get capital financing to where the emissions are and ensure that businesses can invest to get those emissions down. And that's been a consistent position I've had for more than a decade.
Yeah. I think you, I don't have a question, but you said, even though I have 1 and 12 seconds left, I'd like to just make a statement, but it's kind of a question for information from Dr. Litteran and Dr. Carney, and it deals with the ESG movements within finance, within banking. And I know you don't have to invest where you don't want to invest, but as a family farmer in Iowa, and my son Robin runs the family farm, but we're corn and soybean farmers. So let's just assume that the FDIC or some other regulator or bank say to the community bank in Parkersburg, Iowa, that you've got to make sure that you know what the carbon footprint is of the farmer. And in 60 years of farming, I don't know where to start to answer that question. And then I think, so what is the obligation? That banker's under an obligation to get that information for me, but if the farmer can't give the information, how does it get out? So this is what I'm thinking as a historic farming. When I started farming in 1960, you know, we'd make 10 trips across the field and produce maybe 60 bushel of corn to the acre. Today, with minimum tillage or no tillage, we make about 3 or 4 trips across. And we produce, in Iowa, I think the average farmer produced 204 bushel of corn to acre. So you can see that farmers already are producing a unit of food with a lot less units of energy than they used to. And do we get any credit for that? I mean, we've already been helping the global warming issue with more efficient farming and all that. But that banker in Parkersburg can say to Chuck Grassley, you tell us what your carbon footprint is.
Yeah, Senator, it's not an issue of reporting what your carbon footprint is. We all have to be aware of what the carbon flux out of the atmosphere into the ground is. And there's tremendous opportunity for farmers to actually address this problem, to sequester carbon into their soil so they can change the way they farm. But we have to address the problem. We have to measure the carbon. We have to understand the science. There's a tremendous opportunity in farming, in ranching, and in timber lands to address this problem, and I hope we do.
Well, what do you think we've been doing? We've been using minimum tillage for 25 years, no-till for probably about that long.
Well, sadly, the farmers have not been compensated for the things that they have done to sequester carbon into the soil, and to be, you know, they are compensated for being more efficient, but we haven't recognized carbon. Carbon movement into and out of the atmosphere is something that we need to be aware of. We need to measure it, and we need to create incentives. We all understand this. We need to create incentives to reduce emissions. Let's just do it.
I'll flag the Growing Climate Solutions Act as an example to help farmers do that, which passed with big bipartisan numbers. Senator Padilla. And then I had the order wrong. Next is Senator Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income communities, and immigrant communities are more likely to be located in climate risk-prone areas and areas with degraded infrastructure, making them even more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. It's one of the many reasons I was proud to support the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law last Congress, which are making critical investments to combat the climate crisis. And notably, these laws direct resources towards many of the underserved and frontline communities that I just referenced, which far too often bear the brunt of the crisis and other natural disasters. First question is for Dr. Carney. Can you talk about how the climate crisis disproportionately impacts these already marginalized communities and the importance of equity in our financial response and investments?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Yes, it is an unfortunate reality that climate change has these impacts in part through the direct areas in which many disadvantaged communities live, proximity, for example, to our coasts. And of course, this committee will know that 40% of Americans are living within 1/8 of a mile of coasts, and coasts which potentially are subject to on some estimates, $500 billion of property damage over the balance of this century. Secondly, to the extent to which more extreme weather conditions leads to greater volatility in food prices, energy costs, that will also be a direct impact to these disadvantaged groups. And then thirdly, one of the issues that we're all going to be facing around the world, certainly in America as well, businesses and families, is ability to get insurance cover as these impacts become more prominent, the ability to afford it if it is available, and of course, so for families, and I'll finish with this, that are already vulnerable to not have the protection of that the insurance industry can provide because of just the risk, the greater risks that have become central scenarios, if you will, that adds to the vulnerability.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Carney. Appreciate you raising the issue of insurance coverage. We're working with the White House on an initiative in that regard, so look forward to following up with you. But on the same broad theme, for far too long, it's these disadvantaged communities that I'm talking about that have also been underserved or face barriers when it comes to accessing financial services. Unfortunately, as Dr. Litterman wrote in his testimony, certain sectors of our economy are more susceptible to the subsystemic risks of climate change. This includes community and regional financial institutions, given that they typically serve geographically concentrated areas and can suffer potentially significant losses due to natural disasters and extreme weather events. So given that these institutions serve a vital function in providing financial access to low-income individuals and marginalized communities, the risk is even more concerning. Dr. Litterman, can you discuss the risk of these climate-fueled subsystemic shocks to local and regional economies and describe how they could disproportionately impact these communities?
Sure. Well, wealthy communities will be able to build their infrastructure, harden their infrastructure, and be prepared. And I live in California, and we see smoke more often now. Well, if I put a HEPA filter in and I can filter my air, I'm better off. But, not everyone can afford that. People who can't afford to address some of these risks that are coming, whether it's drought, smoke, heat waves, and so on, if they can't air condition their homes, they're going to be suffering. And we see that around the world. When exposed people are impacted by these hazards, it's the poor that suffer the most. So it's absolutely just one more example of where we have inequity and we're not paying attention to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Followed by Senator Van Hollen and then Senator Romney.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm honored to be here on the Budget Committee with you. I just want to commit to you and my friends across the aisle is that I'm as committed as anybody is to leaving this world cleaner, healthier, and safer than we found it. That as a fifth-generation farm kid, that means that my family has been stewarding the land for 5 generations, that the soil, that our farm is in better shape today than it was 5 generations ago. That we've done things like no-till farming, like Senator Grassley mentioned, since 1991, that we planted 20,000 trees, that we have fenced off creeks. We call them cricks in Rhode Island, Chairman, but whichever it is, creeks back home, that flow into wildlife refuges. We've created wetland habitat. Precision agriculture is exploding in Kansas, that we're growing more with less, that we're reusing water, that we're taking the fat from the packing plants and turning it into renewable diesel. My point is that American innovation is working, and that's why the carbon footprint of America is 14% less today than it was a decade ago. So I think my first question is for Dr. Holtz-Eakin, and I want to say thank you for your daily DISH newsletter, which I still read daily, and appreciate your thoughts on the economy. You kind of mentioned this in your testimony. As we try to solve the problem here, which we all believe that the environment is a challenge for us right now, do you think that American innovation will have a bigger impact going forward, or do you think that a federal government heavy hand approach will have better results? And my question is the cure worse than the disease? If the federal government keeps prescribing all these expensive propositions, is the cure worse than the disease?
Well, thank you for the question and the compliments. I'm not sure the latter's deserved, but thank you. There's a real issue in having the climate strategy and the economic growth strategy work hand in hand. And one of the points I tried to make in my opening remarks is that at the moment, the federal budget is an enormous headwind to economic growth. And if we have a climate strategy that exacerbates the budget problems, it is going to make even worse the challenges on raising the standard of living for future generations. And so I worry a lot about that. I also worry about the fact that we're not guaranteed to get anything out of something like the Inflation Reduction Act because it has no sort of global coordination, and this is ultimately a global problem. And so when I think about climate, I come to the conclusion that the global challenge will not be solved without great U.S. leadership. I simply do not believe it is possible for the U.S. to be a laggard in this regard and have there be any real progress. It will not be the case that we can make great progress and provide that leadership if we are crippled by the budget outlook that we have, and if we don't undertake a strategy that features innovation. And I have for a long time been an advocate of using carbon pricing, carbon taxes in particular. Well-designed carbon taxes are huge incentives for efficiencies, innovation, that are completely decentralized. On the ground, people decide how they want to respond to price incentives. That's what made the U.S. economy the single greatest economy in the history of the world. Using the same techniques to address this problem would be exactly the right way to go. And so I think the strategy that the administration has adopted is not the best strategy. I think it will yield little, quite frankly, in climate benefits.
Okay, thank you. My next question for Dr. Carney. 2 questions. Dr. Carney, as you make your assessment of climate, you talk a lot about carbon footprints. How do you assess the cradle-to-grave impacts of what you're looking at? How do you calculate the cost of implementing your policies? And I'm going to give you a for instance. So like Iowa, Kansas, over 50% of our electricity is generated from wind. Unfortunately, wind energy is 7 times more per kilowatt to produce than from natural gas. Solar is probably 70 times per kilowatt more than from natural gas. And then when we transport that electricity, transporting electricity is 10 times more expensive than transporting natural gas. So we're exporting a lot of that wind-generated electricity, and the cost of generating it and transporting it is, you do the math, 70, 100 times more expensive. So my question, going back to you, Dr. Carney, is how do you address the entire cradle-to-grave impact of your policies, not just the carbon footprint, and how do you calculate the cost of implementing your plans?
Thank you, Chair. Just cut me off when I've used up too much time. Very quickly, I might reframe, quote, cradle to grave, Senator, as well to wheel. So the all-in cost delivered energy. I would point out that the levelized cost of wind and solar, new wind and solar, is now comparable, if not through, and in many jurisdictions, it is less expensive than natural gas. That's the first point. The second point, and of course subject to fewer price fluctuations in local and world markets. And then quick point, if I may, just to pick up on the fiscal point, I'll just read into the record that one of the most effective mechanisms, and the chair referenced this at the start, is credible climate policy that would include regulation. And when you combine that with the financial sector and businesses having the right information, you get the investment in technologies that are efficient today, cost effective, and in the types of innovation that will be necessary tomorrow. And I'll just refer to a detailed analysis that Secretary Yellen and I did prior to her
Well,
joining.
we'll have to agree to disagree on your cost analysis of wind and solar power. I could only wish that they were efficient.
I would
Thank you
only
so
point-
much.
I
I
would
yield
only-
back.
One of the largest investors in energy, so that's what we base it on.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony today. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, I agree with your comments on carbon pricing. Many of us pushed for that for many years with appropriate safeguards like border adjustments to protect U.S. domestic industry. This is not a partisan statement. It's a statement of fact. We weren't able to get any support here in Congress from the other side of the aisle on that. And that's why I strongly support the approach that we took in the Inflation Reduction Act, because we have to do something. And I think that if you look at it, we will achieve significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, not as much as I would like. And that brings me to a couple points. Number one, first of all, I think there are huge economic opportunities and job opportunities in going forward with a clean energy transition. In my state of Maryland, we have 2 offshore wind facilities that are being built. 10,000 good-paying jobs projected from those 2 facilities. We also know that the cost of doing nothing is huge, and that's part of the purpose of today's hearing. And those costs are being borne as we speak in terms of taxpayer dollars for more climate resilience at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, and the cost that insurers or individual citizens are paying through insurance and through non-insurance, and just the impact on them and their property and their lives. Mr. Litterman, you testify, and I'm quoting here, that insurance markets are critical to diversify these risks and to create appropriate incentives for individuals, companies, and communities to prepare for extreme weather by building hardened infrastructure and buildings. You go on to say, but the insurance markets are not working properly because historical loss experience is no longer relevant for predicting future losses. I noted that in Florida and Louisiana and California, in at least 2 of those 3 states, if not all of them, you're seeing just last year a number of insurance companies go insolvent because they just couldn't pay the bill for extreme weather events. Can you expand on the comment you made about us being unprepared when it comes to insurance to capture this risk?
Yeah. Insurance companies base their pricing on historical experience. That historical experience is no longer relevant. We are in a new weather environment now. And so we see these tail events happening much more frequently than they have historically. We have to base insurance on what's actually going to happen, or insurance companies are going to pull back. They're going to say, I know it's going to. Look at California and wildfires. The probability of getting wildfires is now much higher than it was historically. Everyone knows that, including insurance companies. And so if you want to buy insurance, insurance companies are going to raise the premium. But the insurance regulators won't allow them to raise the premium because based on what they say. Show me the data. Well, the data isn't, it's changing every day. These things are becoming more and more likely, and so the insurance markets are not working. Reinsurers understand this. They see the risks, and they say, we won't underwrite these losses because we see them coming. And so these markets are just not working. And then you get Florida, the federal government says we'll provide the flood insurance. California says taxpayers will underwrite the costs of fire insurance. This leads to incorrect incentives. What people should be doing is recognizing that we need hardened infrastructure. We shouldn't be living in risky places. And we certainly don't want the federal government to be subsidizing people to live in areas where it's more expensive. That's just going to increase the total cost in the long run. So we have to face the reality. I loved what Professor Holtz-Eakin said. We need to put a price on it. We need to create incentives. People respond to incentives. That's all there is to it. And so we get the right incentives, we'll get the right behaviors. If we have the wrong incentives, and in the insurance industry right now, we have the wrong incentives, and so we get the wrong behavior.
Can you speak a little more to the secondary market of insurers? Because as you said, they get it, right? Costs are going up. As I look at these facts in Florida, after 6 insurance companies went insolvent in 2022 alone, you now see premiums averaging more than $4,200 per year, almost 3 times the national average. So as you say, at the end of the day, we're going to pick up the tab, right? I mean, you're going to pick up the tab either as a taxpayer or you're going to have to pick up the tab through much higher home insurance rates and other insurance rates, which is why, you know, obviously the best course of action is to try to address the issue at its root and reduce the impact of climate change. But obviously we're in this already, so we have to provide the resilience. I can tell you in my state of Maryland, just over the last 40 years, if you look at it, in the last few years, we've seen a dramatic increase in extreme weather events, costing the state of Maryland billions and billions of dollars. So we're going to pay one way or another if we don't figure out how to address this. And as I said, there are huge opportunities economically and job-wise in addressing it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Did you care to respond?
I would just say that we can do better. There are models that we can run. We can get better estimates of what the risks are, whether it's flooding or heat or smoke and so on, and we should. So basically what the insurance market is going to have to do is start relying on climate models to project into the future what these risks are.
Senator Romney.
There's no question.
For your patience.
Pardon?
Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no question about the impact of climate change. It's going to be significant, devastating in some areas more than others. The question is whether we're doing things that will actually make a difference and will lead to a different result. What I'm concerned about is that most of what we do here in the United States is, I'll call it virtue signaling. That term has been used recently. But we do a lot of things that make us feel good about ourselves, but will have almost no impact on global emissions. If we want to do something serious about global emissions, we need to put a price on carbon. And our Democrat friends had the chance to do that during reconciliation. They didn't. And so we can talk about all these other things we're doing and getting more batteries for cars and so forth, but the reason these things don't make a big difference is because the U.S. is not the big contributor to emissions in the world. China is, and Brazil, and India, and Indonesia, and all the growth is going to come from them. China's emissions are greater than the U.S., the EU, and Japan combined. So when we do things here that are very expensive and disruptive to our economy, they don't change what's happening globally. We have to do things that have global impact. So research and technology at a price on carbon are the things that would make a difference. So it's frustrating to talk about this as a huge challenge to our budget and to our economy when it's out of our control, unless we deal in the way I've just described. And yet there's something that is in our control that we're saying, both parties are saying, we won't touch that. And what is in our control is the level of debt we have. The amount of debt we have, I just heard Professor Holtz-Eakin just indicate that the impact on the economy of the amount of debt we're adding up is 10 times the impact of climate change. 10 times. And yet we're not willing to look at our entitlement programs to see if we can balance them somehow. I'm not talking about cutting them or taxing them. I'm just saying let's at least come together and work on it. But the parties are afraid to even come together and have a discussion about how can we balance these things. It strikes me as one of the most outrageous things my generation has done to the coming generations is to say we're going to spend all this money on ourselves. We're not going to tax ourselves to compensate for all that we're getting to ourselves. We're going to take all this money and then we're going to pass on to you for all of your lives slower growth, so a more challenged economy, and higher interest payments. It's unbelievable. It's almost immoral. And so I look at this challenge. Professor Holtz-Eakin, am I reading this right? That the challenge of the debt and our unwillingness to balance what we spend with what we tax, that unwillingness is having a huge impact on economic growth over the future and on the lives of our grandchildren and theirs.
I think it's well said. I'd just amend it in two ways. I would take out almost from in front of immoral, and I would say that it's a disservice to the beneficiaries in Social Security and Medicare to pretend that somehow they can survive in their current form. They cannot. Trust funds will exhaust in under a decade, Social Security trust fund in a decade. It is an enormous irony that something like the Social Security program, which was meant to eliminate income uncertainty in retirement and in old age, is now the greatest source of income uncertainty in retirement and old age, because we have no idea what that program will look like as the years roll forward. So I personally am enormously disappointed at a public debate that suggests we can't touch Social Security or Medicaid. They are the only things we should touch. They are the most important things to touch, and I would encourage this committee to put that on their list.
Thank you. Dr. Litterman, I described what I thought were the major levers that would have an impact on emissions and climate. And that came from a model that was presented by a professor at MIT. They built this huge model there that shows all the things you can do and the impact they have. What was shocking is that almost everything we talk about and we get excited about has no real impact globally, except a price on carbon and, of course, investments in new technology and innovation. Some of that is on the table. But the price on carbon never happened. Am I wrong in that, or is that a fair assessment?
No, you're absolutely right. In fact, I would go further, because when we talk about the budget deficit, as Professor Holtz-Eakin knows, a carbon tax is a great way to raise revenues. Polluters pay, and that reduces the deficit. So, of course, that's the right way to do it. And another thing I would say is that you're absolutely right about the global perspective. This is not a U.S. problem. This is a global problem. And the U.S. has to join the global community in creating harmonized incentives to reduce emissions globally. And, right now, those incentives vary across the board. The U.S. is kind of in the middle with very little incentives. Our strongest incentive to reduce emissions comes from a gasoline tax. If I drive an electric vehicle, I don't pay it. But that's not a strong incentive. Okay? In Europe, the incentives to reduce emissions are over $100 a ton. In many Middle East countries, Russia, Venezuela, there are strong subsidies to increase pollution because they have fixed prices on fossil fuels, which are below the market. So we've got to move diplomatically, and I would say what we have to do in the U.S. is provide our State Department with the tools that they can go and negotiate globally to get these harmonized incentives to reduce emissions.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Romney. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for kicking off our 118th Congress meetings of the Budget Committee with this important topic, and thank you to the witnesses. So I represent Virginia, and it's a coastal state. Our shoreline stretches more than 5,000 miles if you include all the snaking waterways around the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic. And it's home to assets like the world's largest Navy base, one of the largest cargo ports in the United States, tourism destinations like Virginia Beach and historic Jamestown, as well as commercial and residential districts. The second largest metropolitan area in Virginia is the Hampton Roads area with about 1.7 million people. Hampton Roads is listed behind New Orleans as the most vulnerable community in the country to sea level rise. And this is not the only part of Virginia that's affected by climate change. We see intense rainstorms and flooding in the Appalachian region of Virginia that cause much more severe damage than they have in the past. Even though the annual rainfall hasn't changed much, it tends to come in much more violent episodes than it has in the past because of climate change. So obviously very interested in this topic. One of the things that I've been troubled by, and I want to pick up a little bit, Senator Romney was talking about debt and spending and wanting to spend the right way, not the wrong way. One of the things I've been troubled by in 10 years here in the Senate is it seems like we are willing to spend a lot of money on climate change, but only in this sense, we spend in response to emergencies. So we'll do a superstorm Sandy emergency relief package in the aftermath of some significant climate event, and you can pretty much count on bipartisanship. We'll try to find ways to help our communities out when they've been hurt. or we'll rewrite the federal flood insurance program to provide more and more financial support for those whose residences and businesses are getting more severe flood damage than they have in the past. So we'll come in to respond on the back end. But what has been harder to do is find smart resilience funding, or even more importantly, smart prevention funding. I do think, as Senator Romney said, we are on the prevention side. Some of the research investments, either in the CHIPS and research bill and in the infrastructure bill, are maybe front-loading some of these expenses in the prevention side. But if either of you would just have thoughts about, how should, in spending and investing, how should we be balancing between prevention, resilience, and response? And is there a way we should adjust that dial to make it more likely effective?
Well, I think the most important thing we can do is create the incentives now to prevent this problem from getting bigger and bigger into the future. So that's what we have to do immediately. The costs themselves are primarily in the future. And so, among other things, we have to be prepared. I think in terms of what we really need to do to address this problem, as one of the senators mentioned, we have to create the innovation to create the new types of, energy, the infrastructure, the housing, and so on, that will be resilient to the future that's coming. And in order to do that, in order to generate the innovation and the capital and so on, what we need is to create the expectation among investors that there will be incentives that will pay, if you have a low carbon approach, that it'll be more profitable.
Can I just say a word about innovation? And then I do want to have the professor respond as well. One of the things I like is sort of a little virtuous competition in the innovation space. I know some of what we did in the IRA has made European nations kind of mad, like what you're trying to do things that will make it harder for our industries, but then they've decided, well, maybe we better up our investments as well. And that kind of virtuous competition, it can lead to some tough words between otherwise allied nations, but it may not be bad in terms of the overall goal. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, I know you wanted to say something.
Just briefly, I mean, if you take the flood insurance program as an example, for long periods, we didn't update the flood maps and deliberately didn't update the flood maps. So that's a terrible idea, right? You have to know the risks you face. And then once you have those risks, they have to be priced effectively. And that means in some cases premiums that are much higher than have been historically. That becomes politically uncomfortable. Let's be honest about that. But it provides exactly the right innovation and other incentives. Don't build a house where it doesn't belong, right? Then you will not have to pay out of the flood program when it gets hit, move businesses to places that are more secure for the future. All of that is the best kind of signal to send. And it comes from really very mundane structural things in a lot of federal programs, but we're not doing that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Kane. Senator Graham, followed by Senator Kennedy, and then Senator Braun, unless we have Democrats intermediating. Go ahead, Senator Graham.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. This is a hearing worth having for sure. So we all sort of agree on the problem. Climate change is real. It's affecting quality of life on the planet over time. We all agree with that. What to do about it is problematic, but let's talk about pricing carbon. Your price on carbon, what would that translate to, Doug, in terms of increasing gas prices?
I don't have a specific price for carbon that I would translate into gas prices, but the literature says very clearly that the right way to do this is to have.
No, I got it. So
let me finish. Let me finish. It's a revenue-neutral carbon tax so that you use the revenues to get rid of other taxes that people who make gasoline will have to pay. So the net impact on the pump price is not obvious from that. You're getting some things going down, not just up.
So revenue-neutral gas tax. You take the money you collect from gas taxes and you offset obligations in other areas, right?
Revenue-neutral carbon tax, economy-wide, so that you can use the revenues to diminish taxes on capital and labor. Those are corporation income taxes, payroll taxes.
Yeah, I'm making $20 an hour in South Carolina. How do I get my money back for an increased gas tax?
Payroll tax reduction.
Okay, how does that affect Social Security?
The sad reality is it doesn't affect Social Security very much because it's already not going to have enough money. So you better figure that out.
Okay. What would you do?
Well, Senator, I really liked Senator Wyden's plan that didn't get into the Build Back Better, but he suggested that we have a low carbon tax to begin with, exclude gasoline, and then allow the incentive to rise quickly. And so, there are various ways to address this. I would
that
say that the gasoline is very inelastic, and so you really don't impact very much the amount of pollution by putting on a gasoline tax. I think there's much better ways to address it.
How would it affect utility bills? This approach?
How would,
Yeah, I mean, somebody's got to pay. Carbon's generated through transportation and production of energy itself.
well, Senator, I'm not an expert on utility, but I believe that utilities around the country have very different carbon footprints. So
mean-
in an area where you have clean electricity,
Listen,
wouldn't be much of an impact.
Generally supportive, but the problem with this is we talk in circles. I'm asking you, if we go down this road, how much will your utility bill go up? How much gas prices will go up? We need to actually talk more honestly about that. How about something maybe we can agree on? That if we don't get China and India and other big emitters to do better, it doesn't really matter a whole lot what we do here. Do you agree with that, Doug?
I do agree with that.
Does everybody on the panel agree with that? Is one way to do that a border-adjusted carbon fee?
Certainly, it would be if we had a global regime with people all
Well, the EU
doing
has
something,
one, right? The EU has
then
one.
then we should have a border adjustment so it's
Mr. Lin-
uniform.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I
Okay.
think it's a great way to go, and I think it's something that both parties can agree on. So let's move
right.
forward.
So if you're looking at trying to make big polluters like China and India change their behavior, we do all the things back here at home, may drive up prices. When they send products into the country, they're going to pay a pollution fee, for lack of a better term. You agree with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We need to measure the incentives globally
Okay.
to reduce emissions. We need to harmonize them, and we need to get them to the appropriate level. So let's work together to do that.
If we do electrification of the vehicle fleet along the lines that car companies are talking about by 2035, 2040, how much demand in power production will that create in America?
I don't know, Senator.
Do you know, Doug?
I don't know the number off the top of my head. We're happy to get it to you, but in my written
like a lot.
testimony, it's like a lot.
It's
Yes.
like a lot. Where does that a lot come from? Can you do it without natural gas?
I don't think so.
Can you do it without natural gas, Mr.?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
What you need to do
Okay,
is you need to
first-
create the
first-
right
whoa,
incentives
time
and
out,
let the
time
market
out,
work.
time out. How much increase in demand for power will come from electrifying the vehicle fleet? How much? 100%, 50%, 10%, 200%? Do you have a clue?
How much of the electricity demand will be increased by
Yeah,
electrifying?
the cars are plugging into something.
Yeah, I don't know.
So in my
Well, how
testimony,
can you say if you don't know, there's no need for gas? This is the problem, thanks.
Who said there was no need for gas, Senator?
Senator Kennedy is up next, followed by Senator Braun. And for the record, for people who came late, we actually have a third witness who happens to not be visible because he's with us electronically, but it's Mark Carney, who was the former chief of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Litterman, how long have you been studying climate change and possible solutions?
Studying, well, I was the head of risk management at Goldman Sachs. I didn't worry too much about
Tell me the
climate change
number
at
of
that
years,
time.
if you would, Doc.
How many years? Let's
Yes.
say 15.
All right, how about you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin?
about 25.
Okay. Dr. Litterman, how much will it cost to make the United States of America carbon neutral by 2050?
I don't know, sir.
So you're advocating we do these things, but you don't know the ultimate cost?
Yes, absolutely. I certainly don't know the ultimate cost, and it's very uncertain. It depends
Dr.
on,
Holtz-Eakin, do
it
you know how
depends
much it
on
will cost to make-
innovations, it depends on,
I understand, I'm just trying to lay a foundation here to understand your expert testimony. Dr. Holtz-Eakin, do you know how much it will cost to make the United States of America carbon neutral by 2050?
Depends how you do it. If we do it all in the federal budget with directed things, it'll be
Public and
super
private
expensive.
dollars.
Sorry?
Public and private dollars. It's ultimately private dollars anyway.
Yeah, I agree.
So how much?
You're going to look at $50 trillion.
$50 trillion. Okay, thank you. If we make the United States of America carbon neutral by 2050, by spending $50 trillion, which you're advocating, I gather.
No?
Okay. Then strike that last part. I'm wrong. You're not advocating. You're advocating something.
If you're going to do something, do
If-
something smart. That's what I advocated.
Okay. If we spend $50 trillion to make the United States of America carbon neutral by 2050, how much will that lower world temperatures?
I can't answer that because we don't know what China and India and the rest of the globe has done.
Okay. Have you heard anybody from the Biden administration say how much it will lower world temperatures?
No.
Does anybody know how much it will lower world temperatures? No?
No one can know for sure.
Okay. Dr. Litterman,
yes.
if we spend $50 trillion, or however much it takes, to make the United States carbon neutral by 2050, how much will it lower world temperatures?
Senator, that depends on the rest of the world. We have to work with the rest of the world. We're in this together.
Well,
It's
what
one
if-
world.
what
We
if-
can't
what
build
if-
a wall around the United States and say,
what if we spend $50 trillion, Europe cooperates, most Western democracies cooperate, but India and China don't? How much will our $50 trillion lower world temperature?
we're in this together. Senator, we
How
have to
much
get
will-
the world to
do you-
work together.
How much, I get that.
Okay.
How much will it lower world temperatures?
If China and India do not help,
Yes.
I don't know.
Okay. Dr. Litterman, do you believe, based on your observation, you seem to be a very intelligent, well-informed man, based on your observation of Mr. Xi Jinping, that Mr. Xi Jinping will ever do anything that is inconsistent with China's best interests in the name of global climate change?
I understand that China has a federal carbon tax.
Okay. Yeah, but faced with a policy, okay, where China does something that's not in its best interest, but it does it because it's in the global best interest. Do you think President Xi would do that?
I think that President Xi understands that we have to work together to address this global problem. Yes, I do. And it will be in the best interest of China to work with the United States to address
So you
this
think
problem.
the answer is yes?
I think the answer is that it's in China's best interest to work with the rest of the world to address this problem, as it is in the United States' best interest to work with the rest of the world to address this problem, to create harmonized incentives to
Do you
reduce
believe in the
emissions.
tooth fairy?
No, sir.
Do you believe in the Easter bunny?
No, sir.
Do you believe that Jimmy Hoffa died of natural causes?
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been here 4 years on the Budget Committee each year, and the last 2 years prior to this, we did 16 hearings, and we didn't do one hearing on the mechanics of actually doing a budget. This is the Budget Committee. We haven't put one together fully budgeted and appropriated on time in 25 years. I've got 4 kids that now run my business, 3 of my 4 kids. And I was on a school board 10 years. state legislator for 3 years. No other place works like that and has a business plan that works into the future. I also come to the Senate and believe, as Republicans and conservatives, that if we don't weigh in on big issues of the day, shame on us. And then we're going to be at the expense of whatever the other idea is. Started the Climate Caucus back 6 months after I got here. Got 6 other Republicans to join, and we've been an engaging caucus, a real caucus. It's met over time. So the issues are there, but I think unless we want to change the name of this committee to the General Issues of Concern Committee, we owe it to the American public that we're not going to base it upon doing no budgeting, no appropriating, doing it behind closed doors, and dropping 4,100-page bills in our lap that none of us can read through, and then having the gall to borrow the money from our kids and our grandkids. That is shameful. We should be fleshing out the climate issues probably in EPW. I've been the loudest senator on the Republican side that says we have a broken healthcare system. Fixed it in my own business 15 years ago, made it consumer driven, put skin in the game for my own employees to be real healthcare consumers. Cut costs by 50%, have not had premium increases in 15 years. That sounds like it'd be unbelievable, but it's true. When you do things that make sense and that are sustainable, and I've got healthier employees for that now. So, healthcare, it's breaking the bank in terms of, mentioned earlier, Medicare, until you reform the healthcare industry and embrace competition, transparency, don't give hospitals all the rules and regs they need to become an unregulated utility, like a monopoly, in the sense of how they work, probably going to see costs going up. So I'm not going to weigh in on the climate issue other than we've been doing it. The experts there, the leaders and captains of industry, I think are accepting it as an issue. It's going to be solved in that arena through technology, not here. And it does beg the question, when China's building a coal-fired plant weekly, how does that whole thing fit into the equation? So I want to cite a few more statistics, and then I'm going to ask Mr. Carney, who is out there in the cyber world, and Dr. Holtz-Eakin, what you think about the trajectory we're on. The only budget out there that anybody's had the nerve to put out there would be, I did it last year, privilege motion. We should discharge a budget resolution by April 15th. There'll be some of us to do that again. But just cutting to what we do, which is no budgeting, no appropriating, and then whether you believe in reforming things on a climate basis and healthcare, what about the idea that we're adding trillions to our national debt? 18 trillion when I got here, now 31 trillion. Started back in 2000 when we put a couple wars on the credit card. That took us from 5 trillion in debt to 10 trillion. Next administration said, well, we're not going to be outdone. Added another 6 trillion. I get here, it's 18 trillion. It's been off the rails ever since. Start with Mr. Carney. You come from the banking industry. I debated Bernie Sanders for 25 minutes on the Senate floor about the modern monetary theory. Can we keep borrowing and borrowing without having the consequences of crowding out all the issues that are going to come into play? Is that a viable long-term business plan? And then like Dr. Holtz-Eakin to weigh in as well.
Thank you, Senator. I'll make a couple quick comments. The first is that crowding out is an issue. I think Professor Holtz-Eakin has made this point in this fora and other fora. And it is a relevant issue for climate change because of the costs of adaptation, resilience, and delayed action is going to lead to much greater crowding out and bigger economic impacts as well. So the fiscal situation you describe, and I won't comment obviously directly on U.S. situation, but this underscores the importance of revenue neutral use of regulation and effective policies that other senators have been referencing. Last point I'll make before handing over to the other witness is I would just refer, given the earlier discussion, to the carbon tax in Canada, which is revenue neutral, is returned to Canadians and ensures about 70% of Canadian households come out net ahead, including.
What about the
small-
modern monetary theory, climate aside?
I don't. I don't.
Okay, I
subscribe
figured
at
you
all.
may not weigh in on that. Go ahead.
No, well, no. That's a theory, and to which I do not subscribe.
Well, I can tell you it's a bad theory. Anywhere else you borrow from future generations, it does not work out. Dr. Holtz-Eakin.
Well, one, the federal budget is on an unsustainable trajectory and it's getting worse. Two, it is imposing costs on the economy today and will increasingly impose those costs. The crowding out is real. And three, there's nothing about modern monetary theory that coincides with the real world experience. It's just incorrect.
Yes, and thank you for that. And I think we should try to discharge a budget resolution by April 15th. If not, I will take one to the floor again, because it's our responsibility to our kids and grandkids not to run this place like we currently run it.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to take a brief moment to say that I appreciate the opportunity to serve on the Budget Committee as a new member, and especially to do so at a time when the state of our federal budget is in such profound disrepair, perhaps more so than at any other time in our nation's history. 15 years ago, our public debt, measured as a percentage of the American economy, was at just 35%. Today it stands at 100%. And even according to fairly rosy objections, within the next few decades, it'll get up to 200%. And whether it's decades or just a few years away, we will reach a point where our interest on the national debt becomes the largest line item we have, bigger than Social Security or Medicare or defense. This fiscally irresponsible path that our federal budget is on is something that increases insignificantly the odds of a debt crisis and the associated economic pain that will inevitably be borne by the American public if and when that crisis arrives in its full force. Just last year, the Congressional Budget Office noted that the very tangible consequences of our federal debt need to be kept in mind. Quote, the high and rising federal debt that CBO projects over the next 3 decades would have serious consequences for the economy and federal budget, including the crowding out of private investment, higher interest costs, and increased risks of a fiscal crisis. So let's not fool ourselves. And most importantly, let's not fool those we represent, the American people. Our ballooning deficits and burgeoning debt have been driven by and will continue to be driven by runaway profligate spending by the federal government, not because of any effects of climate change. That is a different thing. That's not what has caused our ballooning debt and deficits. Fear has become an all too prevalent quality in American political discourse, and specifically among many in the United States Senate and on the left who seek to use climate alarmism to justify a widespread federal government takeover of our economy and a radical, unrealistic, and damaging transition of our energy sector with all of its abruptness and all of its disregarding of things that have worked and have helped elevate people out of poverty, and yes, even helped, in many instances, clean up the environment. Dating back to at least the 1970s, a group of left-wing academics and media allies began making apocalyptic claims about climate change, stipulating that climate-related apocalyptic events would wipe out hundreds of millions, if not billions, of the Earth's human inhabitants over the next few decades. What's more concerning than the kooky theories of Paul Ehrlich or Thomas Malthus is that a growing number of Democratic members of Congress, bureaucrats, and private sector business people are now making similarly outlandish and inflammatory, alarmist claims about a looming climate apocalypse, or at least throwing support behind Green New Deal-style legislative proposals and regulatory mandates. Not only is this supremely misguided and short-sighted, but it's not remotely necessary, certainly isn't desirable. The reality is that U.S. energy-related carbon emissions have been steadily declining over the last 15 years without any Green New Deal-style takeover of the federal budget and the American economy. And at the same time, China's carbon emissions have nearly doubled over that same time period. Democrats in Congress and in the Biden administration need to work with Republicans to promote American energy independence rather than promoting less efficient forms of energy, especially at a time of significant energy inflation that's been financially debilitating to low and middle income American households. And those energy costs translate also to higher food costs and higher costs for everything we buy and everything we do. These costs don't fall on the wealthy like they fall on the poor and middle class. The brazen regulatory overreach currently being carried out by unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats must come to an end, as those decisions of making law are expressly reserved for Congress under Article 1, Sections 1 and 7 of the U.S. Constitution. Lastly, it's my hope that this committee will spend more of its time and effort this Congress deliberating ways to reduce our budget deficits so that we can stabilize our debt while putting our budget on a pathway to balance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee. To be clear, the reason we're having this hearing and the reason that we're going to continue to have hearings on this subject is that $10 trillion of our federal debt can be ascribed to exogenous shocks to our economy with which we had to cope. It wasn't cheap, but we had to do it. The biggest exogenous shock on the horizon out there is climate upheaval. That's not just me. That's bankers, corporate CEOs, scientists, economists, people who look at this problem all around the world. And it matters because we have the chance to head it off now if we take appropriate steps, many of which, as we've heard in this hearing, have support on both sides of the aisle. I'd also add that I mentioned at the beginning of the hearing the prospect of healthcare reforms that can lower cost. Accountable care organizations were a perfect example of that, and I look forward to working with members on both sides of the aisle and with CBO to drill into the cost basis for that and try to figure out what we can do to do more of what looks like already trillions of dollars in healthcare savings that are projected from these changes. But I'll close with a round of questioning. I didn't have the chance to ask Dr. Holtz-Eakin questions, so I'm going to yield myself a second round. And let me ask you, Dr. Holtz-Eakin, in preparing your testimony today, did you familiarize yourself with the Bank of International Settlements so-called Green Swan report, which warns of, and I quote, catastrophic and irreversible impacts from climate so large that, and I quoted them again, it would make quantifying financial damages impossible?
No, I did not read that report.
Did you familiarize yourself with the report put out in April of 2019 by dozens of central banks that says estimates of losses are large and range up to $20 trillion when looking at the economy more broadly?
I don't know that report.
Did you familiarize yourself with the Deloitte Global Turning Point report, which concluded that in 2070 alone, global GDP could be 7.6% lower compared to a baseline that does not account for climate change?
I read that report, scanned that report when it first came out.
Did you familiarize yourself with the report from economists, largely centralized in Cambridge, but from around the world, that said the effect on the U.S. economy would be more than $3 trillion in losses, and GDP could shrink by more than 5% due to the collapse of stranded assets.
I scanned that one as well when it came out.
Did you familiarize yourself with the report from Freddie Mac, the American mortgage giant, that said, and I'm quoting here, that the economic losses and social disruption related to coastal property losses, quote, are likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and the Great Recession?
No.
I gather you did familiarize yourself with the CFTC report that Dr. Litterman wrote, correct?
When it was released, yes.
And when it was released, its opening sentence was, "Climate change poses a major risk to the stability of the U.S. financial system and to its ability to sustain the American economy." Is that correct?
Yep.
And the second paragraph after its header says, "Risks include disorderly price adjustments in various asset classes, with possible spillovers into different parts of the financial system, as well as potential disruption of the proper functioning of financial markets." Not a good outcome, right?
Not desirable.
Not desirable indeed. And then it also said, "A central finding of this report is that climate change could pose systemic risks to the U.S. financial system across multiple sectors, geographies, and assets in the United States, sometimes simultaneously and within a relatively short time frame." Do you recall it saying that?
Not specifically, but I believe that.
And you wrote a little report on it in September of 2020, which noted that climate-induced risks will cause dramatic financial fluctuations and the stability of the system will be at risk. And then on the backside of your one-pager, you said that the potential risks to financial markets posed by climate change represent a pervasive policy challenge. Have I quoted you correctly?
Yes.
Thank you. Closing words to Dr. Litterman?
Yeah, I would just say I am surprised, pleasantly surprised by the amount of agreement by certainly the witnesses here and the senators as well. And so I hope we can move forward. That's all.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I think there are things that we can do. I think the key points coming out of this are that we've got to move forward globally. We can't pretend that we can build a fence around the United States, solve climate here, and not be affected by what's going on in China and India and other places, Russia. That we do have the tools to affect the behavior of China and India and other countries through carbon border tariffs, that they're already underway in the European Union, and that if we can pull together and be sensible about this, we can take advantage of, I forget whether it was you, Dr. Litterman, or Dr. Carney, who said negative risks, opportunities, that there is a huge upside to getting this right. I'll close with the Deloitte number, which was that if we don't get this right, it's $180 trillion in cost to the global economy. If we do get it right, it's $40 trillion in added value. The upside, the negative risk, the opportunities. Let's go for that. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing in the committee today. Their full statements will be included in the record of our proceedings. As information for all senators, questions for the record are due by noon tomorrow, with signed hard copies delivered to the committee clerk in Dirksen 624. Emailed copies are also fine. We will ask the witnesses to respond to those questions within 7 days of receipt of them. And with no further business before the committee, the hearing is adjourned.